So good morning, everybody. Glad that you're here and welcome to October's webinar on backup planning. You know, backup planning is one of those things that we just as soon not have to worry about and feel like it's not all that important a deal. But as we look around and watch the world around us, backup planning is important. Whether it be because of natural disasters, because of insider threats, because of some kind of hardware failure, no matter how you look at it, planning for your backups is one of the most important things you can do to protect your business, and by extension, to go ahead and protect all the data and all the things that you do as a business or as a company. So as we stop and talk about backup planning, several questions we need to ask. By the way, I should mention too that if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and type them into the Q&A. We'll get to those down towards the end. That would be the place to do it. And if you've got anything to say, we'd love to go ahead and hear what you have to say about that. So let's start out as we work through our backup planning webinar this morning and ask the question, why plan for backup? Well, probably that gentleman on the left tells you as much as anything about why you should plan for backups, because if you don't plan, often something will go ahead and happen, something that's going to really make you wish you had. And there's a lot of different things that can happen that can make it important to have backups. For example, you may plan for backups simply because bad things happen. And it does, whether it be weather related, insider threats, someone taking stuff, hardware failure, hardware corruption. There are lots of bad things that can go ahead and happen. In addition, what a lot of people don't realize when they think about their computer equipment is that your data is worth more than the computer equipment itself. Step back and think about all the time and all the man hours you've got involved in preparing data and in all the data that's stored in your systems. We often look at the computer and think, wow, that computer is expensive and all that. But in reality, the most expensive piece, the most expensive asset that you have is that data that you've got created and compiled and that is part of your business. And so because of that, because that data is so terribly, terribly important, backup planning is part of any business continuity or disaster preparedness plan. We've all seen as we've watched the weather events taking place across the U.S. over the past few days and few weeks, how important business continuity and disaster preparedness is. And because it is so important, it's because these bad things can happen. Having a plan for our backups is one of the best things we can do to ensure that our businesses, our organizations, our livelihood goes ahead and continues. It's interesting to note that data loss is costly. There's a lot of places on the web where you can find different parameters, but I've included this URL here at the bottom. This URL talks about the number of businesses that fail after a disaster of some kind, whether it be failure of equipment or somebody stealing the data or whatever, and the number of businesses maybe who can't come back after 6 months or whatever. It might be worth taking a look at that just as you think through the importance of why you do backup planning. Okay, so let's stop and talk about backup planning. I want to run through 6 different concepts that are important. This is not an all-encompassing 6 concepts. I mean, this is not everything a person would want to know, but this will give you a good framework from which to begin planning and thinking about your backups. First one, number 1, when you think about backup planning, remember to protect all of your data. Now, we say that, and that seems so simple, and we think, yeah, we'll protect the data that's on our computer, but really, many times there is more data involved that needs protected than what we would realize. For example, if you use either the Google or the Office 365, the Google Workspace or the Office 365 environments, that data in those environments needs protecting. I would bet money that you did not thoroughly read the license agreement that you signed when you signed up for Office 365. And yet every one of these cloud systems makes the point that they're not responsible for data loss. We have seen instances where cloud providers did indeed lose client data. And so because of that, when you talk about any Office 365 or Google Workspace environment, you want to be sure that you have backups of that data. Yes, it's stored in the cloud. Yes, I know that. But having a copy that you can access or put someplace else is important. Likewise, backing up your email. Email stored in the cloud. For many, there's a copy on your computer also. But we have seen times where clients have had a provider and that provider actually ended up losing their email that they had. How are you going to recover it? Lots of good stuff is there. Back up your email. If you're running virtual machines, which a lot of organizations do anymore, those virtual machines need backed up somehow. If that hardware that they're on fails, then you may lose the virtual machine. Being able to recover that virtual machine and the data that's on it, important. Likewise, if you're using any kind of cloud-based applications, and everybody uses cloud-based applications nowadays, that data is stored in the cloud-based application. But what happens if that cloud provider goes bankrupt, somebody hacks it and gets into it and steals everything or wipes out everything, an employee gets angry and upset? What happens to your data that's there? Likewise, back up your client computers along with your mobile devices. If you've got people who store valuable information on their phones that is business related, then you need to take steps to protect that. Part of that protection is obviously some kind of mobile device management stuff like Microsoft Intune or Endpoint Manager. But equally as important, if they have business data that's being created on the phone, to back up their mobile devices so that you have copies of that. Servers, we can all think about backing that up, but you may also have certain line of business applications that run on your servers. What about data from those in your databases or your configuration files, or even the servers or the license keys themselves? They may all need to be backed up. If you're using something like SharePoint or some other file sharing system, whether it be Dropbox or ShareFile or any of those kinds of things, you need a backup of those. Once again, if those services are breached or something happens, you need to be able to recover your data. And then one thing a lot of people don't think about are configuration files. This comes into play, for example, with a lot of either network devices or a lot of Internet of Things or IoT kinds of stuff. For example, if you are involved in running any kind of services for a utility and you've got equipment out there that's got config files, have you got backup of those configuration files so that if that equipment failed, you can bring in new equipment and rebuild the configuration for what they needed to do? Or if you've got configuration files just about any place on different things, you need to back those up. And then it's quite possible that you'll configure out some other places where you've got data. So my point in talking through this here is that there is much more data to be backed up than what many times we realize. Then in order to provide a robust security system for our data and equipment, in order to be sure we have things backed up that can be handled and that we can do recovery, we need to look at all of these different areas. And it is important. So how do we perform backups? Well, over the last few years, probably the most important backup strategy that has come into place is called the 3-2-1 backup strategy. And that's the strategy that we try to follow through ourselves. The 3-2-1 backup strategy basically says this, that when it comes to backing up your data, you need 3 copies of your data. Well, immediately a person's going to say, why in the world do I need 3 copies? Isn't 1 copy enough? Well, many times it's not, because it's very common for one of those copies to get corrupted somehow. For example, one thing I've seen is that people will use a flash drive or some kind of a flash storage system, whether it be a drive or a thumb drive or whatever, without realizing that many times those devices have a limited number of read writes on that particular medium. So they've been faithfully backing up copies onto that, and then suddenly when they try to restore, bingo, they discover that that data is not accessible because the drive itself failed. Or you make 3 copies, and maybe you've got something in a backup system and you are unable to use that software to recover it. 3 copies of data is considered the standard for making backups nowadays. But along with 3 copies of data, you use at least 2 different storage media. So if I was making my backups, I would not put all my backups on another server. I might have part of my backups on another server and part of them on some kind of removable device. Or I might have some kind of cloud stuff, or it used to be use tape all the time. I need something that's different. The point being that we're building in redundancy by making multiple storage media part of our backup story. Then the last one's very important. We've got 3 copies of our data. We're using 2 different storage media. And then the last one, number 1, says at least 1 copy is configured as a cloud backup. So we're putting at least 1 copy of our data someplace into some kind of cloud storage. That way we know that it's not going to get destroyed. If a tornado comes through our area, all the backups aren't going to be destroyed. If somebody comes and steals it, everything's not gone. And notice the last statement there says that we preferably use cloud backup that is immutable. Now we'll come back to that one in just a minute. But the 3-2-1 backup strategy then, 3 copies of your data on at least 2 different storage media, with one of those copies as a cloud backup someplace, preferably as immutable. Let's take a minute and talk about immutable storage. You know, that's not one of those words that we use in our everyday conversation. And so because it's not one of those words that we use in our everyday conversation, it's a little hard at times to wrap our head around what we're talking about. But immutable itself has a very simple definition. Immutable simply means that whatever you write there is unable to be changed. All right. So if we're talking about putting an immutable backup, putting our backup on immutable storage, that means that we're putting our backup someplace where we can't change that backup, where it is fixed for a certain period of time. Well, that's actually pretty important. The reason it's important is because ransomware, when it hits, often tries to go through and delete your backups first. So you've probably seen stories in the news where somebody got hit with ransomware. They were unable to recover, and they were unable to recover because the ransomware software went through and deleted all the backups first. By the way, that's one of the reasons that if you're using a thumb drive or a removable drive to do your backups, you definitely do not want to leave that plugged into your computer, because if your computer gets hit with ransomware, first target's going to be those backups on that removable medium. But even if you're not using removable media, even if you're using something else, you're using some kind of backup system, ransomware is smart enough that many times it goes through and tries to delete your backups first. And it'll look for what you're doing. It'll look for indicators of what kind of systems you're using and what it should do. So when you're making backups, we like to always put that cloud copy on immutable storage someplace where it can't be changed. Now, caveat, there's a lot of stuff that advertises itself as immutable, and it doesn't really fit the highest quality definitions of that. The highest quality definitions say that true immutable backups cannot be changed by anyone for a period of time. So, for example, we'll use us as an example. If we've got backups in immutable storage, which we do, and we've got them set so that they can't be changed at all for a period of, say, 90 days, even I can't, none of my team can delete those backups from immutable storage. They are there, they are fixed. Nothing's going to change them. And not only that, the cloud backup provider who has immutable backups then has multiple copies of that spread across multiple zones. So those backups are there, redundancy, they are fixed, they can't be changed, and nobody can until that clock runs out that you set when you put it in there. Nobody can change or delete those until then. You can tell by what I'm saying that I believe immutable backups are really, really critical and really important in today's business world. But there's a second thing that is often not talked about. I think it is likewise equally as important. We've talked about 321, multiple copies, two different media, one of them in cloud backup. We've talked about how that we're going to use immutable storage. But another thing I like to do is to use multiple backup systems. So we may have one system that backs up one copy and a different system that makes a different backup copy. The reason we do that, and people would ask, why in the world do you have multiple backups to use? The reason that we would do that is simply this: software can fail. We've been dealing with some stuff lately where, can you believe it? Software failed. And so it's totally possible that maybe you put on an update for something, and that particular update made that software system that you had working forever fail in some reason, and you don't understand it. Two different backup systems help you have a way to mitigate that risk and to handle it. Besides software failing, hardware can fail. You may be running on a particular server or a dedicated backup appliance of some kind. That hardware may fail. Until you get that fixed, your second backup system does your backups and provides the protection and the recovery for you. And then updates can break things. How many times have we updated our computer, whether it be with Microsoft updates or some kind of application update, and it turns out that that update caused a problem itself? Well, because of all of these different issues where software, hardware, updates, I didn't put in there, people can cause problems. They may misconfigure totally by accident. Because we've got all of these ways in which our backup systems can fail, having multiple backups provides an additional level of redundancy. And that additional level of redundancy is critical if we want to be sure that our business or our organization stays in existence. Now, when we talk about doing backups and we talk about running these systems and making them work, there are some pretty common industry-wide metrics, two in particular, that we need to understand and can help us as we plan our backups. Okay, and these are going to be acronyms, and we're going to explain what it means and what it comes from. The first acronym that we need to understand as we stop and look at backups is the acronym of RTO. RTO stands for Recovery Time Objective. And that recovery time objective basically says, how quickly do you want to be able to recover? So let's say that you've decided that in the event of a catastrophic failure, that you need to have your system set up so that you could recover back to a working condition within 24 hours. Okay. So that would be your recovery time objective. Maybe you've got a key system within your organization that you say, for that particular key system, because it's so important, we have to be able to get that system back up and running within 4 hours. That would be your recovery time objective. So the recovery time objective basically says, how quickly do I want to recover? How much downtime can I take before things become really problematic? How fast do I need to recover? But the second metric goes hand in hand with this. And the second metric is called RPO, or Recovery Point Objective. The recovery point objective basically says how much data can be lost between backups. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's say that you've got some kind of a database system that you're constantly putting data in. You've got people who are entering data in it all day. And you've currently got your backup set up so that that database is backed up every 2 hours. Okay. What that's in effect saying is that if you do a backup at, say, 9 a.m., and then your next backup is going to come at 11 a.m., that in between there, you've got a 2-hour gap. If your failure point occurs at, say, 10:30, you've got an hour and a half worth of data that has not been backed up. Question is then, how can you recover that hour and a half worth of data? Some people, if they're doing a lot of data entry, say, well, we can recreate it from the paper trail that we have, and that's totally possible. But if that's automated data that's coming in from some kind of measuring devices or some kind of automated systems, there may not be any way to recover that 2 hours worth of data. So the recovery point objective says, how much data can be lost between backups? I'm still in good shape. Now you can say first off, that RTO and RPO, those two metrics basically are different perspectives of the same problem. And yet, as these two perspectives are given, these two perspectives work hand in hand with you as you go plan your backups. But these two perspectives, these two metrics, also have an interesting consequence. And I would bet you that you can probably guess what that consequence is. For if you've got faster recovery time objectives or lower recovery point objectives, the point is if you've got a faster time you have to recover, or you're saying that you've got a lower amount of data that you can possibly lose, the more you tighten down those metrics on either side, the more it increases the cost of your backup system. And so having a balance between RTO and RPO, as well as on business recovery time, is a very important thing for you to do, a very important thing for you to understand. Well, we've learned a lot as we've walked through and talked about the 3-2-1 strategy. We've talked about RTO and RPO, very important metrics for us to know. We've talked about immutability, and all of this stuff is important and really good. But what happens if you get up to the point where you have to recover from your backups and you discover that, lo and behold, your backup system, your recovery plan doesn't work like expected? That's why we have point number 6. Point number 6 says that you need to periodically test your backup and recovery processes. Now, this is where that we find a lot of pushback many times from people. And the pushback comes because testing costs money, right? You got to have people devote time to it. You may have to have some equipment available to restore copies of systems to see if it really did work. You've got to have people look at the backups to validate whether it really did happen like you planned that think that it should. And so periodic testing of your backup plan, as well as testing of your recovery plan, is important. And it's not the kind of thing that you just do one time and it's done forever and you never have to do it again. It's important that you do periodic, at least yearly. I prefer 6 months, but you do periodic testing of things. And maybe if you've got a complicated backup plan, you're not going to test recovery of the whole thing. But maybe this 6 months we test recovery of this piece, this 6 months we test recovery of this piece. But testing your backup and recovery is critical. Why? Well, number one, testing provides a guarantee and a validation that your backups are not corrupt. Guys, there is absolutely no way to know that your backups are good without trying to do a restore from them. That's just a fact of life. And so the only way to guarantee that all this time you're spending doing backups is really doing any good is to test them and see if you can restore from them and see if you can read them. And yes, I have seen cases where people thought they had good backups and they thought they had plenty of backups, and they went to try to restore their backups, and bingo, their backups were corrupt. And so they lost everything, even though they thought they were covered. When you look at it from that perspective, testing backup and recovery is a small price to pay. Those people that lost everything, that can be horribly expensive and catastrophic. So it's a small price to pay to do periodic backup and recovery testing of that. In addition, testing validates that you're backing up the right things. A real common problem people have is that when they sit down to review a system that they're going to protect with backups, and they evaluate what it is that they need to protect, they back up maybe 95% of things that they need, but they forget this configuration file that they need to back it up. Or they forget this other XML file or something like that. And so testing not only validates that your backups are not corrupt, that they're good, The testing also lets you validate that you backed up everything you need. With today's computer systems and how complex they are, it is really hard to make an educated guess as to what all you need to back up. So the only way you can prove it, recover it, see if it works, validate that the backup works. Testing also proves that recovery can be done. If you've set recovery time objectives at X number of hours, then your staff or whoever you have working needs to practice and needs to validate that you can indeed recover in that period of time when you need it done. Besides validating that your backups are good and that everything is okay, it validates that your plan works and that you can recover. Many times people will say, yes, we need to recover within 4 hours, and yet they've not taken into account things like bandwidth constraints or data speed or processor speed, all these kinds of things. So testing recovery proves that you can recover when you need it done and that you can recover in the period of time that you think that you should be able to. Now, that's a lot of stuff that we've talked about today. And if you're like me, that's going to take a little bit of time to think over and to figure out exactly what it is that we're talking about as we go through this. And I'm sure that there are some questions that have come up while we were thinking through these and talking about. Let me remind you that if you want to see a replay of this webinar, it will be posted on YouTube in a short period of time. There is a handout that goes along with this. If you'd like to use this handout with other people in your organization to talk about what backup planning is and how important it is, go ahead and download a copy of that. That's freely available at the URL link that you see right there. And of course, if you would like to contact us to talk about anything to do with backups, we'd be happy to discuss with you what needs done and perhaps give you some direction on what's involved in planning your backups there. Now, I know that as we talk about this, there are probably some questions that have come to your minds about things. And I know Stacy is monitoring this webinar and handling things for us. If you've got any questions, feel free to type them into Q&A. We'd love to hear what it is that's on your mind as we talk about that. Stacy, has anything come up? What would you like to add about this?
Yeah, Steve. One question is, what could a business or organization expect backups to cost?
Okay, cost is a really big question, and cost is a really good question all the way around. To answer that question, the cost is going to be determined by how often you do backups, what type of media you use to do backups, how you consider your RTO and RPO objectives, whether or not you use immutability, those kinds of things. So cost is going to vary. If you use immutable cloud backups, for example, you're going to pay X number of dollars per gigabyte as you back that stuff up. And that's going to stay there for 90, however many days that you do it. If you use multiple backup systems, that's going to depend on what you buy and how you do them. So the cost for backups is really going to be pretty unique to each individual organization. And that's why considering all of these factors together, RTO, RPO, what you need backup, everything, that's why considering everything together is important so that you come up with a plan that works for you and a plan that's feasible. Okay, good question. Unfortunately, it doesn't have an easy answer. Do we have any other questions here today? All right. Well, for you guys that were on, thank you very much for coming. I slipped to the wrong slide. Thank you very much for coming. Feel free to download that handout there at the URL on the web, and we will see you at next month's seminar. Thanks for being a part of this.